They were the most powerful men on the battlefield, U.S. generals commanding thousands, symbols of strategy and strength. Yet, one by one, some of them vanished. No witnesses, no remains, no official explanations. And when questions arose, the U.S. government buried them beneath classified files and silence. It wasn't during peace. It was during war, Vietnam, Korea, even the Persian Gulf. Men with access to top-secret operations, suddenly gone, reported as missing in action, or worse, reassigned. But the families never saw them again. Was it enemy capture? Treason? Or something far darker? Something America didn't want the world to see? In the next few minutes, we're going to open files the government wished stayed sealed. We'll trace the stories of generals who disappeared under mysterious circumstances, explore hidden reports, and follow the chilling patterns that point to something bigger than coincidence. Because behind every name erased from the record lies a story that refuses to stay buried. Stay with me as we uncover the truth they tried to hide. The vanishing commanders. The jungle was breathing, not in the way forests normally do, but like a living creature, wet, restless, and waiting. Helicopter rotors thudded overhead, fading into the distance as a storm crawled across the Vietnam sky. Down below, an American convoy advanced through the dark green maze near Quang Tri province. Among them was Major General Arthur Beckett, a man whose instincts had saved hundreds, whose orders shaped battles, and whose name would soon vanish from history itself. It was June 1971. Beckett's last radio transmission came at 0400 hours. His voice was calm but strange, almost detached. "We're surrounded," he said. "But it's not the Viet Cong." Repeat. "Not the Viet Cong." Then static. Minutes later, every trace of his command post disappeared. Men, vehicles, equipment, gone as if the jungle had swallowed them whole. At first, command labeled it an ambush. But no bodies were recovered. No wreckage, no signal flares, nothing. Even the helicopters sent to locate him returned damaged, its pilot mumbling incoherent fragments about lights in the mist. Within 48 hours, every document mentioning Beckett's name was reclassified. His family received a short letter, missing in action. That was all. But here's where it turned strange. Months later, villagers 20 miles from the site reported finding a military jeep half buried in mud, with a U.S. flag decal scratched off. Inside it was a torn map, marked with red ink circles, and the name Operation Nightlance. The operation didn't exist in any Pentagon record, and the coordinates led to an area officially designated as uninhabited terrain. When a journalist named Daniel Keller tried to follow up, he was warned off by a colonel who said, "Some men disappear for a reason." Keller ignored it. He published an article draft titled "The Vanished General" and submitted it for review. It never went to print. 3 days later, Keller's car was found wrecked off Route 9. Officially, an accident. But his notes, gone. His typewriter ribbon missing. And the editor who'd seen the draft suddenly resigned without explanation. The pattern was beginning. By 1973, 2 other generals vanished under similarly murky circumstances. One in Laos, another in Cambodia. Both were linked, according to whispered intelligence briefings, to covert reconnaissance missions. Witnesses described strange lights near crash zones, unfamiliar insignias on recovered uniforms, and sealed containers flown out under heavy guard. Yet, in every instance, official statements recycled the same words. Enemy capture suspected. Search ongoing. Inside Washington, something colder was happening. Files marked with the generals' names were recoded as non-operational data. Officers who asked too many questions were reassigned to desk duty. The few who persisted found their careers ending in medical retirement. One night in 1974, A man claiming to be part of Beckett's reconnaissance unit contacted the journalist's widow. His voice shook as he said, he knew it wasn't the Viet Cong. He saw what we weren't supposed to see. Before he could explain, the line went dead. For decades, the story was buried under layers of bureaucracy and fear. Until 1996, when a retired intelligence analyst named Henry Cole came forward with a box of decaying reels labeled Project Silent Wind. Inside were partial transcripts of intercepted field recordings, all dated between 1968 and 1971. One stood out. A faint voice, unmistakably Beckett's, whispering, "If this message gets out, tell them Washington's lying. It's not the enemy. It's us." The recording cut there, replaced by the hiss of static. Cole handed the material to a military historian, who vanished days later while traveling to D.C. to authenticate it. The tapes resurfaced years later in a private auction in Bangkok, sold under the description Cold War Artifacts. Their buyer remains unknown, but something in those fragments changed the course of the investigation. Beckett's final words hinted at betrayal, not from the enemy outside, but from within the American command itself. The implication was unthinkable, that the disappearances weren't accidents, weren't the fog of war, but deliberate erasures. A surviving sergeant from Beckett's division, interviewed under anonymity, described a hidden detachment operating parallel to their own, soldiers with no patches, no names, and no records. They moved like ghosts, he said. When they showed up, someone always went missing. By the time he returned to the U.S., those memories haunted him. He claimed Beckett had discovered something, a covert program testing psychological operations on both enemy and allied troops, meant to break the human mind under battlefield pressure. When he tried to expose it, he and his command simply vanished. Was this the reason Washington buried the case? The theory sounds like fiction, until you compare the timelines. Every general who disappeared had been involved in classified psychological or biological research programs under defense intelligence contracts. And every one of those projects later ceased to exist. In 1978, the Pentagon quietly declassified a handful of unrelated Vietnam records, yet one document bore a faint, typewritten note at the margin. Reassigned the Beckett file to Division M, no release clearance. Division M was never listed in any branch directory. And still, years later, strange things kept happening. A Freedom of Information request filed in 1999 returned a single sheet of paper, almost blank except for one line. Record expunged by Executive Order 1972. The signature? Illegible. That's where the official trail ends. But survivors tell another story, that Beckett's men were seen months after their supposed disappearance, marching under armed escort toward a sealed valley along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. No insignias, no calsigns, no return. Every time new evidence surfaces, it disappears just as fast. Witnesses recant. Files go missing. And the few who dare reopen the case describe feeling followed, not by journalists, not by veterans, but by people who never give their names. Half a century later, the question remains like an echo in the jungle. What did General Beckett see before he vanished? And why did the United States need him to stay gone? Because somewhere in those missing hours of radio silence, between the words, not the Viet Cong, and the static that swallowed his voice, lies the first thread of a cover-up that stretches far beyond one man, reaching into the deepest shadows of American warfare. The silence of Washington, it began quietly, just like all cover-ups do. No alarms, no headlines, only silence. A silence so heavy it pressed against the walls of every office where someone knew. The name Arthur Beckett. In the months after his disappearance, the Pentagon shifted its tone. There were no official press conferences, no urgent operations to locate him. Instead, An invisible eraser moved across paper reports, rewritten, photographs cropped, names replaced by code numbers. One by one, his colleagues were reassigned overseas, his command dissolved, and even his portrait from the War College wall taken down. The story was supposed to die there, but it didn't. Congressional aide named Robert Hawley noticed something strange while preparing a budget review in 1972. 3 defense allocations each. Millions of dollars had been marked for recovery logistics, but no recovery teams had ever been deployed to Vietnam under that code. The signatures on the authorizations were identical to those on Beckett's mission files. When Hawley asked his supervisor, he was told it was above clearance. 2 weeks later, he was transferred to a post in Alaska. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Beckett's widow, Margaret, refused to believe the official line. She received a sealed letter from a friend within the Defense Department, warning her not to pursue inquiries. It contained one chilling sentence. They erased him to protect something that never officially existed. For years, she tried to get answers letters to congressmen, interviews, appeals. Every response was the same. We regret your loss. The records are incomplete. She began recording her calls, documenting every denial. Then one night, she received a call from an unlisted number. The voice on the other end was low, distorted, but unmistakably American. Mrs. Beckett, it said, your husband's last report wasn't a radio transmission. It was a file. A file he sent home. The line went dead before she could ask more. From that moment, her life changed. Strange cars parked outside her home. Her mail began arriving opened. And in the middle of one night in 1975, her house was broken into. Nothing was stolen except her husband's old footlocker. That same year, Senator Thomas Radley, known for his fierce independence, submitted a motion to investigate missing high-ranking officers. He called it the Beckett Inquiry. For 3 months, he gathered testimony behind closed doors. When he finally presented his findings, the transcript was sealed before the public hearing began. He resigned a week later, citing personal reasons. Years later, a fragment of his notes surfaced in a declassified archive. The generals didn't vanish by chance. They stumbled upon a program meant to rewrite human behavior. What kind of program could justify erasing generals? In 1976, a new journalist, Eleanor Marsh, from the Washington Ledger, picked up where Daniel Keller had died. She traced every mention of Operation Night Lance and Project Silent Wind through procurement records and field reports. She found that all shared one identical routing code, MX-12. That code belonged not to the Department of Defense, but to the Central Intelligence Agency. When Marsh tried to interview former CIA officer Frank Dalton, he agreed to meet her in a diner outside Arlington. He looked gaunt, trembling. You shouldn't be digging here, he said, eyes darting around. Night Lance wasn't about recovery. It was containment. Containment of what? She pressed dot. He leaned closer. People. Then he left, leaving behind a folded napkin scrawled with coordinates. Marsh followed them to a restricted airfield in Nevada, later identified as an old military test site. But before she could publish, her article was pulled by her editor. She was told it didn't pass National Security Review. Within days, she vanished while driving to meet Dalton again. Her car was found abandoned, engine still running, purse untouched. Dalton was found dead 3 days later. Official cause: self-inflicted gunshot. The pattern was undeniable. Behind the curtain of patriotism and bureaucracy, something moved slow, methodical, erasing everyone who got too close. The war had ended, but the silence deepened. Then, in 1984, a strange report emerged. A construction crew repairing a tunnel beneath Arlington Cemetery discovered an unmarked steel vault sealed behind concrete. Inside were dozens of boxes labeled only with initials and years. The workers called military police, but before any inventory could be taken, a group of men arrived in unmarked uniforms. The site was cleared, and the workers signed confidentiality agreements. The vault was never mentioned again. Still, whispers spread rumors that some of those boxes bore the same code, MX-12. By the late 1980s, Margaret Beckett's health had declined. Yet she never stopped writing letters. In one of her final notes to a friend, she wrote, "If they say he's gone, they're lying." Arthur found something they feared. He wasn't erased, he was hidden. She died in 1989. Her funeral attended by two unknown men who placed a single black rose on her casket and left without a word. A year later, a defense contractor's whistleblower leaked several shredded memos to a newspaper. Among the fragments was one with a recognizable name, General Arthur Beckett, classified Mia Delta. The word Delta was circled 3 times, with a note beside it, transfer complete. Subject isolated. Subject, not soldier, not officer. Subject dot, and for the first time, the cover-up began to take shape. The disappearances weren't random. They were connected to something experimental, something that blurred the line between warfare and manipulation. But then came the most disturbing revelation of all. In 1991, a photograph surfaced from a declassified satellite archive. It showed a group of men being escorted across a barren testing range. One of them, bareheaded, slightly hunched, looked eerily like Beckett. The timestamp was from 1974, 3 years after he was declared missing. Experts dismissed it as a coincidence, but those who'd known him swore it was him. The story spread quietly through veteran circles. Late-night radio shows debated whether the government had hidden a secret facility where certain officers were contained rather than lost. The official agencies denied it all, labeling the claims as conspiracy. And yet, in a military museum outside Chicago, an old visitor log from 1998 contained a curious signature. Written in faded ink, it read, "A Beckett." The curator thought it was a prank until the next morning, when the page was missing from the book. Whatever happened to those men wasn't buried in the jungles of Vietnam. It was buried here, beneath the polished floors of the very institutions that had sworn to honor their service. And now, a new name was about to emerge, another general who disappeared years later under eerily familiar circumstances. Proof that the silence of Washington wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something still unfolding in the shadows. Operation Mirage, the first whisper, came from an Air Force hangar buried deep in the Nevada desert. No official insignia, no listed coordinates, just a string of numbers stenciled in black across a chain-link gate, 5412A. Inside, technicians worked under humming fluorescent lights, dismantling the wreckage of aircraft that officially did not exist. Among the crates of broken fuselage and scorched metal sat a file cabinet marked Mirage Division. When the Cold War was at its height, Mirage was nothing more than a rumor whispered in military circles, covert joint program between the CIA and Defense Intelligence, created to experiment with human perception under extreme combat stress. But the documents recovered years later revealed something darker. Mirage wasn't designed to test soldiers' endurance. It was designed to erase their reality. In 1970, General Beckett's unit had been reassigned to provide security oversight for Mirage, experiments operating out of secret jungle bases. The goal, at least on paper, was to test battlefield adaptability using sensory deprivation and hypnosis to control fear responses. But one internal memo, signed with the code MX-12, hinted the program had gone further testing on high-ranking officers to evaluate memory isolation and self-erasure response. Beckett had discovered it by accident. He'd been investigating unauthorized troop movements near Laos when he stumbled upon an abandoned medical outpost littered with blood samples, recording tapes, and a half-burned logbook listing officers' names, including his own. 2 days later, he made that final radio call. It's not the Viet Cong. Years later, when Eleanor Marsh's notes resurfaced, they contained a map of 5 sites tied to Mirage. One was the Nevada airfield, another a forgotten compound in Cambodia. The rest were redacted. By 1993, a researcher named Dr. Alan Raines, a retired Army psychologist, broke his silence. He had once worked under Mirage's predecessor, Project Sentinel, tasked with inducing controlled hallucinations in pilots. He described an offshoot program where select generals were invited to undergo cognitive stress training to simulate enemy capture. They were isolated, deprived, monitored for weeks. But when it was time to reintegrate them, some refused to recognize their own names. They broke them, Raines confessed during a recorded interview. They rewired memory pathways so deep that some of them never came back. Beckett wasn't the first. He was the one who realized it was happening. Raines died 2 months later, ruled an overdose. His family insisted he never took medication. Then, something chilling emerged, a declassified photograph labeled Mirage 73. It showed a row of men in fatigues standing before a mirrored observation wall. One of them bore a resemblance to General Beckett, his eyes distant, face pale. Behind the glass stood a group of scientists in civilian attire, one holding a clipboard stamped with the word Isolation Protocol. As journalists tried to authenticate the photo, the archive containing it was suddenly sealed again under a new executive order. The digital copy vanished from the online record. Only one man had seen the original before it disappeared, a young archivist named Jason Hall. In a later interview, he claimed there was something written in red ink at the bottom of the photograph. Subjects retained for Phase 2 relocation. Phase 2. If Phase 1 was erasure, then Phase 2 meant something else. Relocation. But to where? That question took investigators to the Arizona desert, where an abandoned airstrip still carried traces of Mirage's operations. Locals spoke of convoys arriving in the middle of the night, trucks covered in tarps, escorted by black helicopters with no markings. One old rancher said he saw men being led into a hangar and never come out again. When he reported it to local authorities, federal agents showed up the next day and confiscated his camera. Inside the airstrip's control tower, a single logbook was found years later. Its entries stopped abruptly in 1974, the same year Beckett was declared officially deceased. The last line, scrawled in shaky handwriting, read, "Final departure Mirage assets transferred east." East, toward Washington. That revelation sent ripples through the community of cold case researchers who'd been chasing Beckett's trail for decades. They began piecing together sightings of high-ranking officers listed as dead who were reportedly seen years later at classified installations in Maryland and Virginia. The sightings were dismissed as mistaken identity until one man produced a fragment of film, reel from a 1976 defense briefing. In the crowd, behind the podium, stood a uniformed figure with Beckett's exact insignia. The image was grainy, his face half-shadowed. But it wasn't just Beckett. Standing beside him was another general who had also vanished, Briggs, last seen in Laos in '73. Why were 2 dead generals attending a secret Pentagon meeting? And why were their names never logged? What followed was stranger still. The meeting transcript, though heavily redacted, contained a peculiar phrase. Mirage subjects to be retained indefinitely under Defense Directive Echo 7. Echo 7 appeared nowhere else in used records, but in one Soviet intelligence memo. Obtained decades later, Echo 7 was referenced as an American containment program for compromised assets. Beckett, Briggs, and others weren't missing. They were contained. The reason? They had been exposed to something the government couldn't risk leaking. Something psychological, or perhaps chemical. One surviving scientist described Mirage's final stage as an experiment in selective amnesia. If the generals had resisted or remembered too much, they could destabilize not only missions, but the entire foundation of classified intelligence itself. That was the secret the United States had buried. Its own generals, transformed into ghosts of experiments gone wrong. But here's the part that no one saw coming. In 2007, a Freedom of Information release accidentally included a scanned memo referencing reassignment of Mirage subjects to civilian observation networks. That meant survivors had been integrated back into public life under new identities. Ordinary citizens, living among everyone, unaware of who they once were. One name in that memo was partially visible. B. et A.R. Her. When the document was discovered, it was retracted within hours. But by then, copies had already circulated online. If true, it meant that somewhere in America, General Arthur Beckett might have been alive living as someone else. His past buried under layers of false memory. A journalist who tried to trace the memo's origin found herself followed. Her emails hacked, her family warned to cease unauthorized investigation. And yet, before she vanished, she sent one final message to a colleague, a single line that reignited the entire mystery. I found him. No name, no location, no proof, just those words. Since then, no one has heard from her again. But her last signal was traced to a small town in Montana. A town that curiously doesn't appear on modern maps. And that is where the trail of Operation Mirage leads next. The patterns in the shadow's snow fell softly over Montana that night, blanketing the valley in silence. In the distance, the faint outline of a town emerged, barely more than a few dozen houses, a gas station, and a church whose bell hadn't rung in years. On maps, it was marked as Harrow Creek, but anyone who drove through said it felt wrong. As if the town didn't want to be found, the journalist's last trace had ended there. Her car was discovered abandoned beside a frozen river, the keys still in the ignition, her notebook torn apart in the back seat. Locals claimed they never saw her, but one waitress swore a stranger matching her description had been there days before asking about a man who went by Mr. Arlen, a quiet, polite veteran who lived on the outskirts. Alone. Mr. Arlen. The name was ordinary enough, but when investigators cross-referenced it, something stood out. The man's age, height, and military pension file aligned perfectly with what would have been General Arthur Beckett's profile had he lived. His Social Security record, however, began in 1975, the very year Beckett was declared dead. Those who'd met Arlen described him as kind but withdrawn. He carried himself with quiet authority, his posture too precise, his eyes too cautious. Children said he spoke in short, clipped phrases, always scanning the horizon before answering simple questions. When asked about his past, he said only one thing: some memories aren't yours to keep. Rumors spread quickly through Harrow Creek. Strange government vehicles visited Arlen's house once a month. He received packages with no return addresses, all marked Federal Supply Division. And once, during a town blackout, a neighbor claimed to see a blue light flickering through his basement window steady, rhythmic, like the pulse of a machine. In 2010, an amateur historian stumbled upon the town while following a separate trail of missing Cold War officers. He met Arlen by chance in the local library. The old man was reading a worn copy of The Art of War. When the historian mentioned General Beckett, Arlen froze. His knuckles went white against the book's spine. Then, softly, he said, "That name was never meant to outlive the jungle." The historian recorded the conversation on a pocket device hidden in his jacket. The audio that survived was faint but chilling, Arlen spoke of a division within the division, men tasked not with winning wars, but with rewriting them. They thought they could make soldiers forget, he whispered. But memory isn't a file. It leaks. He stopped abruptly, then added something that still haunts listeners. The jungle never left us. They just built it here. 2 days later, the historian disappeared. His rental car was found miles away, engine still running, doors open, recorder missing. Authorities dismissed the story as rumor. But researchers who later analyzed Department of Defense satellite data noticed something eerie. Harrow Creek had no power grid registration, no postal routing. Officially, it didn't exist. That's when patterns began to surface. Across decades, every general who vanished shared 3 connections. Each had been stationed near experimental sites tied to Mirage. Each had led units authorized under psychological resilience programs, and each had later been declared dead or mentally unfit after unexplained disappearances. Yet the paper trails didn't end with their deaths. Pension checks were quietly issued under new identities, often in remote towns. The same government accounting office handled all transactions, one located under the innocuous name Veterans Health Administration. Sector 12, researchers began to see a larger design. The disappearances weren't isolated cover-ups. They formed a map. From Vietnam to Nevada, from Maryland to Montana, every site lined up along a corridor of abandoned research facilities. It was as though the government had built a web of shadows, relocating its own lost officers to hidden corners of the country. But why? One theory suggested control testing the long-term effects of memory suppression under civilian conditions. Another hinted at containment isolating men who knew secrets too dangerous to release. The truth, however, seemed to be something between both. In 2012, a leak surfaced from a former intelligence contractor. Among the files was a document titled Project Echelon, Post-Mirage Continuity. It detailed a strategy to manage Category Delta personnel, high-ranking subjects, whose exposure to psychological interference operations rendered them security liabilities. The directive was clear: integrate under new parameters. Monitor indefinitely. At the bottom, a list of 4 names. One was A. Beckett. The leak was suppressed within 48 hours, but it confirmed what conspiracy had long suspected. Those generals hadn't died. They'd been hidden inside their own country. And yet, something still didn't fit. If Beckett was alive as Arlen, why hadn't anyone simply extracted him? Why keep him buried in anonymity? Unless he wasn't just a victim. A former intelligence officer came forward claiming Beckett had been leading a quiet resistance from within the Mirage network. According to her, a handful of surviving subjects had begun regaining fragments of their erased memories. Their lives, fake names, false families were unraveling. She said one of them had sent a message before vanishing again. We remember what they made us forget. Within months, there were reports of unusual activity across multiple military archives. Files reclassified decades ago were suddenly accessed. Surveillance flagged internal logins from inactive accounts, some registered under the names of the long-missing generals. As if ghosts had returned to finish what they started. Back in Montana, Arlen's house caught fire on a winter morning. The blaze burned too hot, too fast. Investigators found no body, no remains. Only one object survived, a metal dog tag, blackened and bent. On its surface, beneath layers of ash, 2 letters remained visible. AB. The town was evacuated soon after. Within weeks, Harrow Creek was cordoned off under environmental containment orders. Locals were relocated. Satellite images later showed the entire valley flattened. No houses, no roads, no sign it had ever existed. But 3 months later, a security camera at a rural gas station in Idaho captured a man in a heavy coat, walking with a slight limp. He paid in cash, avoided eye contact, and bought a bus ticket east. When he turned toward the camera for a brief moment, his face bore an unmistakable scar identical to the one General Beckett received in Vietnam. No one has seen him since. Yet the silence that followed didn't feel like an ending. It felt like preparation. Because buried inside one of Rain's recovered memos was a final note, written in a different hand. The subjects are adapting. Memory walls deteriorating faster than expected. If that was true, it meant the men they tried to erase were remembering, and whatever they remembered was never meant to surface again. Somewhere, the pattern is breaking. The shadows are moving, and one final revelation waits behind a door that no one dares open. The door marked Project Echelon, Phase Omega. The truth buried in the archives, it began with a power outage. Not across a city, not even a street, just one building, deep beneath the National Archives complex in Maryland. At 2:43 a.m., the backup generators flickered, then went dark. For 7 minutes, the surveillance feeds went black. When they returned, one access terminal showed a single line of text on its monitor: Phase Omega, initiated. No one knew what it meant, or so they said. Weeks later, a federal historian named Claire Donovan, known for chasing forgotten Cold War files, filed a Freedom of Information request for Project Echelon. She never expected a response, but one came. A slim beige envelope with no return address, postmarked from a city she'd never visited. Inside were two things: a keycard labeled Sublevel 3B and a folded note that simply read, "He's still alive. Follow the Omega file." That night, curiosity won over caution. She drove to the archives, her heart racing as she used the keycard at an old freight elevator long marked under maintenance. The doors opened to a floor that shouldn't have existed, rows of metal cabinets stretching into darkness, each drawer sealed with wax stamps bearing a single word: obsolete. In the far corner, she found a file box labeled Project Echelon, Phase Omega. Its paper smelled of damp metal and age. Inside were hundreds of typed sheets, some brittle, others oddly fresh. The first document was a transcript of an internal Pentagon briefing from 1978. The header read, "Status Review, Mirage Continuity Program." The first line sent a chill down her spine. Subject, Gen. Arthur Beckett. Psychological containment successful. Identity reestablished under civilian parameters. Recommend continued observation until cognitive drift exceeds control margin. It was confirmation Beckett hadn't died. He had been living under a new identity, monitored for decades. Claire turned the page. It contained surveillance notes, daily routines, health reports, even details of his handwriting analyzed for linguistic stability. The reports ran yearly, until 2009. Then they stopped. The final entry was brief. Subject self-aware. Transfer initiated. Transfer to where? Beneath the documents was a small audio reel labeled Omega 13. She hesitated, then loaded it into a portable player. A crackle of static filled the room. Then a voice hoarse, weary, unmistakably human. "My name is Arthur Beckett. If you're hearing this, it means I remembered." Claire froze. "I was part of something called Mirage. They told us it was about resistance training, but it wasn't. They broke us down, piece by piece, made us forget who we were, then rebuilt us to believe we were someone else. I've lived 40 years in a life that isn't mine. I see faces I should know, but don't. I dream of jungles that never end." The tape crackled again. They think they can control memory, but memory fights back. It doesn't vanish, it waits. And when it wakes up, it takes everything with it. A pause. Breathing. Then a faint sound, like footsteps approaching. Beckett's voice lowered. "They're coming. They don't want the truth out. If you find this, don't look for me. Look for the others. They're waking up too. Then silence. The reel ended with a faint mechanical click. Claire sat motionless, her pulse pounding. She copied the files onto a flash drive and slipped it into her coat. But when she turned to leave, the elevator wasn't working. The overhead lights flickered, and somewhere in the corridor, a soft hum began to rise steady, almost mechanical. A low voice echoed through the intercom. Unauthorized access detected. Please remain where you are. She ran. Down the corridor, through a side passage marked Storage Restricted. Behind a steel door, she found an exit to a service tunnel. She burst through it, stumbling into the cold night air. The next morning, the sublevel she had entered was sealed permanently. Officials denied it ever existed. Days later, she released portions of the Omega files anonymously through an encrypted forum. Within hours, the site was taken offline. But by then, the documents had spread. Among them was a hidden report titled Echelon Containment Stability Overview, 2009. It described something extraordinary and terrifying. The memory suppression techniques used on the Mirage subjects had begun to fail. Fragmented recall, emotional instability, and spontaneous resurfacing of erased memories were documented in nearly all surviving participants. Some experienced vivid war hallucinations decades after the conflicts had ended. Others vanished completely after exhibiting hyperlucid behavioral responses. Translation: they remembered too much. The government's solution was phase omega total data removal, not just from the subjects, but from history itself. Erase their existence entirely. Yet one note, handwritten in the margin, suggested that something went wrong. Containment breach possible. Subject A be unaccounted for. That was the same year Harrow Creek burned. And in a chilling parallel, several months later, surveillance satellites recorded a thermal anomaly near Glacier National Park, an isolated cabin, emitting brief bursts of radio frequency identical to those used in Mirage-era field transmitters. When a ranger team arrived, the cabin was empty. On the wall, carved into wood, was a single phrase: "They're waking up." After that, incidents began to multiply. Retired officers across the country reported sudden blackouts, visions of operations they'd never participated in, and flashes of a man with a red insignia and cold gray eyes. Psychologists called it shared delusion. The Defense Department called it coincidence. But those who'd read the Omega files knew better. It wasn't delusion, it was reactivation. Somewhere, hidden in plain sight, the remaining Mirage subjects were regaining fragments of who they once were. And whoever still ran Echelon was scrambling to contain it. In 2015, one final encrypted transmission surfaced on the dark web, traced to an unknown source within the Department of Defense. It contained no text-only coordinates in northern Canada, and an audio clip. It was Beckett's voice again, older, rasping, defiant. They erased us to keep their secret, but we are the memory now. You can't bury what remembers. The transmission ended with the faint sound of rotors and gunfire. No one knows if Beckett survived that night, or if the voice was even truly his. What's certain is that soon after, entire sections of the Defense Digital Archive vanished. Whole decades of data erased. And then nothing. Only silence. The same silence that began half a century ago, in a jungle where a general spoke his last words into static. It's not the Viet Cong. Perhaps he was right all along. Whatever took those men wasn't the enemy outside. It was the one inside. And if the Omega files were real, then the war that created those disappearances never truly ended. It simply changed its battlefield, moving from the jungles of Vietnam to the corridors of the human mind. And somewhere, in that darkness, the forgotten generals are still waiting, remembering what they were never meant to recall.